Hello and welcome to the first of the review sessions for AP World History. This one covers Unit 1, Civilization. A few suggestions while you watch these. I recommend looking back through your textbook notes for this unit, as well as maybe glancing through the readings, looking at the notes from the class discussions online, either before you watch this or afterwards to fill in some of the gaps. So I'm going to be focusing on the readings and history labs from this unit, as well as connecting some of that information to the textbook notes that you did. The first two readings in this unit, Rivers of Life and Food, Wealth, and Power, have a lot to do with the Neolithic Revolution and farming and how we moved from hunter-gatherers to more complex societies. The second two pieces, or numbers 4 and 5 in this unit, the History Lab and the Great Convergence to the First Great Divergence, examine more closely how those societies worked once they became complex. How did you govern them? How did you rule them? How did you keep them from falling apart? So before we dig into this, since this is the first of these review videos, it's important to have a sense of where things fall on the map. So when I refer to things, I'll be using as much as possible terminology from this map. And this is how the AP test breaks up regions of the world. A lot of times, instead of saying Canada and the United States, they'll also just say North America. And then you have Middle America and South America over in the Western Hemisphere. Africa typically gets divided between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa because of the natural barrier of the Sahara Desert. It sometimes also gets split into West, East, and South Africa if you want to chunk up Sub-Saharan Africa a little bit more. Europe occasionally gets split into Eastern and Western Europe as well. Russia is this huge chunk in Northern Europe and Asia. And then the rest of Asia gets split into the Middle East, also sometimes called Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, which is like China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, and then Australia and the Pacific, as you can see here. These are really important terms to know because a lot of times an AP question will ask you to compare things going on in two or more different regions of the world, and so you need to be able to identify them quickly. Let's jump into this unit with the first reading from way back in September, Rivers of Life by David Montgomery. Basically, in this piece, Montgomery is making some arguments about how agriculture started in a time period that we call the Neolithic Revolution. He also makes some arguments tracing agriculture forward until you get close to the present day, looking at some of the environmental effects of farming societies. The first argument that he makes is that farming was a response to changing environmental conditions. This is related to the Ice Ages and the idea that people migrated to places that were good for hunting and gathering, and as the Ice Ages ended, those places dried out and suddenly the food supply started to shrink. Now, in a lot of cases, people weren't really able to move because there were other groups of people living nearby, and so they were forced to find new ways to develop food. This isn't to say that agriculture just happened all at once. The process of domestication of both plants and animals took a long time. A lot of times, hunter-gatherer lifestyles and farming lifestyles existed kind of intermingled, so that people were doing some domestication and also doing a fair amount of hunting and gathering as well. But one of the key things that Montgomery brings up is that once you've really transitioned into doing more farming than not farming, you can't really go back. You're stuck. And the reason for this is because farming produces a lot more food than hunting and gathering ever could. Once you're doing farming well, you're producing huge food surpluses and you can start carrying a larger population. And if you tried to move away from farming, you would have huge amounts of starvation at that point. This isn't to say that farming is an easy transition. There's some real consequences that go along with it. Farmers are really tied to the environment. As soon as there's a couple of years of drought, you can have some real crises on your hands. That helps explain why in certain regions of the world, where there were abundant natural resources and hunting and gathering was a really stable lifestyle, people never actually took up farming, despite the fact that farming would have been a pretty good strategy in those places and has been now. I think a good example of that are Native Americans in California, where there was just abundant food to be had for hunters and gatherers, and there was no real reason to make a shift to farming. That said, California is obviously an amazing farming environment now that it's been imported in. So, the other piece that Montgomery wants to bring up is that farming was being continually improved upon in this time period as societies invented new technology that would help them farm. Irrigation is a good example. Various kinds of plows that could be pulled by domesticated animals are good examples of this. But there are some real consequences to this technology. Irrigation, in a lot of cases, Montgomery points out, led to all sorts of salinization of fields where the water would come in and then evaporate and the salt would be left. And if you do this once, it's not a huge issue, but over a period of 100 years or 200 years, enough salt would build up that the fields would no longer be usable. The same issue happens with erosion, where there's a layer of topsoil that's needed for farming that's very rich in nutrients. And as trees get cut down for fields, that topsoil sometimes erodes and washes away. And then you can't use that area anymore for farming. And so we see a lot of civilizational collapse in these ancient time periods due to environmental problems, both man-made and otherwise. The next reading in this unit, Food, Wealth, and Power by Tom Standage, really builds off some of the ideas that Montgomery talks about from the first reading. And it really digs into the relationship between farming, agriculture, and social structures that start to develop. And the way Standage does this is he begins by exploring hunter-gatherer societies, modern hunter-gatherer societies, which he says are basically the same, really, as ancient hunter-gatherer societies. And the big thing that he notices is that these societies are fundamentally egalitarian. And egalitarian means that people are treated more or less equally in these societies. They have equal privileges, there isn't a lot of rank, social hierarchies don't exist. And he explains that the reason for this is that there isn't personal property in the way that we're so used to now. There's no way to accumulate wealth, to accrue money, and to build up power or status over others. He then compares this to the kinds of societies that build up in agricultural communities. And what he says is that those communities are able to build up food surpluses. And so not everyone has to be a producer of food. Not everyone has to be a farmer in an agricultural society. And so suddenly with that, you get some real differentiation in society. You get different roles for people associated with different jobs. A lot of times you get a set of political leaders, you get a set of religious leaders, you get scribes, you get taxmen, you get government bureaucrats. This is all related to the idea as well that when you're in an agricultural society, you stay in one place. You can't pick up your fields and move them with you, as opposed to hunter-gatherers who are constantly moving around, following herds of animals, moving from place to place so as not to overhunt. So this leads to differences in wealth and power, and some people invariably in these societies become wealthier and more powerful than others. So Standage looks at how that happened, and what he suggests based upon societies that are more simple politically, that we have evidence of, is that there's this idea which he calls the big man theory, which is that someone in the society became responsible for the collection of and the distribution of food surpluses. And that person oftentimes was not super rich at first. They were often giving away a fair amount of their food to build favor with their fellow people. But the idea is that there's an immense amount of power in that role over time. And so the people who were in charge of things like that, in charge of the food essentially in the society, were the people who controlled the society. So it's time to dig into a few of the actual civilizations that we looked at. This kind of connects back to the textbook notes. And historians oftentimes divide ancient civilizations into two categories. We'll look at the first one now, which is first wave civilizations, and that typically is cut off at about 1000 BCE. So these civilizational hotspots are related to where food production first started. Food production started along rivers. There were key geographical features of where these places popped up. So you have ancient Egypt along the Nile River, you have Mesopotamia and all the various societies in there along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Indus River Valley civilizations in what is now modern day Pakistan, and then you have Zhou Dynasty China, which is along the two main rivers in China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. The first really interesting feature of these societies is that political rule and religious rule were completely interwoven and dependent upon each other. The king was seen as basically a messenger from the gods, if not the god himself, and that was really useful for maintaining control of these societies. It also came with some risk for the people in charge. Most of the religious traditions, and this is another piece that's explored by Standage, were based upon, say, the harvest god. So if the gods smiled upon you, you had a plentiful harvest. And if the gods were angry, then your harvest was terrible or you endured drought or something like that. And so the risk was, if the gods were angry at you and the gods were punishing you, maybe you needed to get rid of your king, who was the emissary of the gods, and replace him with a new king who the gods might not be so angry at. The second feature of these societies is their really limited political control. We're used to societies where the government has an extremely high amount of control over its citizens. These places did not have a whole lot of political control. And that's a lot of times related to technology, the fact that it's hard to get from place to place in a kingdom, the fact that it's hard to conquer other people without more modern forms of military technology. And so these empires and kingdoms were not terribly large. One of the really typical political systems was the idea of the city-state, which has sort of an urban center and then outside around it a bunch of farmland. This was really common in Mesopotamia. There were some places that were able to create larger unified kingdoms like Egypt, and the Egypt-Mesopotamia comparison is interesting because the Nile River was a much more stable producer agriculturally than either the Tigris or the Euphrates. The flood season of the Nile River was really perfect for agriculture in a way that wasn't true in Mesopotamia, and so that allowed ancient Egypt to build a larger, more stable, more unified society. One of the things about political control, though, that's interesting is the ability of these societies to mobilize their people to create this incredible monumental architecture. And monumental architecture is kind of a common pattern around these first wave civilizations. You've got the pyramids in Egypt, you have ziggurats in Mesopotamia, you have these incredible city designs in the Indus River Valley, you have the terracotta warriors in China, these just amazing pieces of art that obviously took thousands and thousands of people to produce. Not only is this artwork or monumental artwork a testament to the power of the rulers, but it also shows that for political control in these regions, it was important to give people things to do. That there was enough food production that it was important to employ people who otherwise wouldn't have a lot going on, and to employ them in building these enormous things. The final piece of this is that these societies were really fairly fragile and vulnerable. We've already talked about environmental problems a fair amount, so the other piece I would highlight is the problem of pastoralist invaders. Societies in this time period can be largely broken into three categories with some overlap. The first being groups who had stayed as hunter-gatherers, the second being groups who were agrarian, who were farming as the majority of their food production. This third group that is local to Eurasia, where they domesticated horses, which are pastoralist groups. Now, Horses are basically the most important piece of military technology in the ancient world, especially with the development of the chariot and the stirrup so that you can shoot arrows while you're riding on horseback. And agrarian societies were very vulnerable to being invaded by pastoralists. And in fact, this happened over and over and over again, is that there would be a rich, settled farming community and it would be taken over by a bunch of horsemen riding in. And these horsemen would then insert themselves into the ruling hierarchy and get used to an agrarian lifestyle, and over a series of generations would assimilate into it, and then they would be taken over by the next group of pastoralist invaders. And so it's a mistake to think of something like ancient Egypt as this monolithic, always the same politically, when really what's going on is there's a variety of ruling families that come in, and they're taken over periodically. And ancient Egypt, for example, gets broken up into the early kingdom, middle kingdom, and late kingdom as a way of differentiating the various groups involved in control. So this brings us to the first history lab, which was about legal traditions. And I tried to highlight some of the key sources here that we read, things that you might want to bring up that are useful pieces of evidence as you're answering AP questions. Hammurabi's Code is an incredibly useful document to cite. It is an example of one of the first legal codes written down in the Babylonian Empire. The text about legalism is an example of early Chinese legal thought. And then the Old Testament, the chunk that we read, was about religious law in Judaism. And so I want to pull three key ideas from this history lab, three ideas that I think are really important. The first is that one of the social structures that comes with farming is the idea of patriarchy, and these legal traditions uphold the patriarchy. Fathers and husbands essentially, under these systems, had almost complete control over their families. And you can see this in the laws, in the ways in which women and children are basically written out of the legal code, and all the laws have to deal with men. And what this means is that women had essentially no political rights, they were invisible politically, and the establishment of the patriarchy has a lot to do with the split in roles that farming brought to families. The other thing, in terms of social structure, that these legal traditions make clear is that a hierarchy in terms of wealth and status had been really established in these places. There were different punishments for people of different status. If you were wealthy, you typically could just pay your way out of crimes, whereas if you were not wealthy or not an elite member of society, you would often have the same thing done to you that you had done. Oftentimes fairly brutal and grisly punishments. And the third and final piece that I'd like to pick out is how the legal codes of a place can really show you a lot about what those societies value. And so there's a lot in these legal codes about honor. There's a lot about the importance of obedience, which makes sense if you're thinking about how you want your society to work. And there's a lot about the role of wisdom in society and sort of who has that wisdom. Legalism, for example, talks about how the masses of people, the majority of whom are farmers, are like children, and it's up to the elites in government to control them and to keep them in check. So we're going to move on now. These legal traditions continue over time and they grow more complex as societies grow more complex and there's more things to sort out as different groups of people are involved. But this gives kind of a basic framework of what legal codes were intended to do and how they worked and how they stratified society. The next set of textbook notes, this is the last week of textbook notes in this unit, concerns second wave civilizations. And second wave civilizations are those groups of more complex civilizations that typically arose after about 1000 BCE. And the examples that I would highlight are Achaemenid Persia, Achaemenid being the name of the ruling family, the city-states in Greece, like Athens and Sparta and all of those, the Roman Empire, and so those are the examples around the Mediterranean, Middle East, Southern Europe, Northern Africa. In China, you've got the Qin and Han dynasties, and then in India, you have the Mauryan and Gupta empires. And the biggest difference between the second wave and first wave civilizations is that these second wave civilizations are much larger. And in being larger, they have to assimilate much more diverse groups of people since they've incorporated all sorts of new territory and people into their empires. This required a more complex range of social structures, professions, legal codes grow more complex. You have caste systems like in India. You have this idea of imperial citizenship and certain rights that go along with that in Rome. And the other way that these civilizations start to try to consolidate power is by adopting state religions. And we'll talk about that more in Unit 2. But just simply, there's some really good examples here. Achaemenid Persia is notable for incorporating Zoroastrianism, which we'll talk about as kind of a precursor to some of the other heaven and hell style monotheistic religions like Christianity, Islam. Rome adopts Christianity late into the Roman Empire when things are getting a little tricky in terms of holding the world together. Han China incorporates Confucianism as a ruling ideology. The Mauryan Empire in India eventually incorporates Buddhism as a foundational religious practice. These are really important ways that these empires brought people together and created a sense of shared belief and community among a diverse group of people. And this is also really different from those first wave civilizations, which believed that the king and the gods were all sort of part and parcel, they were all the same. This says here we have these ruling people, and then we all believe this thing. The last thing about these empires I'd like to point out is they were more resilient, they were larger, they had more various sources of food production. A really good example of this is the Roman Empire's conquest of Egypt and its use of Egypt as a kind of breadbasket to provide food for the whole empire. But they were still vulnerable to environmental crises. A lot of the collapse of these empires has to do with a combination of food crises and, again, invasion by what they would call barbarians, but again, pastoralist invaders who came in. And this is how the Roman Empire fell. This is how the Han Dynasty fell. The governments weakened. The political rulers were maybe weak. They made some poor choices. There were some environmental problems, and they got overrun by people on horses. So now we're at the last reading in the unit, from the First Great Convergence to the First Great Divergence, which I know was a brutally difficult reading, so I'll try to sum it up quickly. There's two parts to this reading. The whole thing compares the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty, and it does that because by about the year 0, the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty controlled a huge number of people globally. In terms of all the humans on the planet, a decent percentage were in either one of those empires because of just the huge number of people that were in these agrarian centers. The Great Convergence explains the many, many ways in which these empires resembled each other. They both started as smaller city-states outside of the main region of political conflict, and they militarized. They took over what had been initially their more powerful neighbors, and they were able to unify huge areas. The Roman Empire basically unified everything around the Mediterranean, which again is southern Europe, it's some of the Middle East, it's a big chunk of northern Africa. The Han Dynasty, or the Qin Dynasty that came before it, unified the areas around the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, that big chunk of eastern China. They resembled each other in some other really interesting ways as well, in the ways that they had a shift in how the empire was governed. So the Roman Empire went from the Roman Republic, which was basically a senate consisting of members of the aristocracy who voted on things and made decisions, who were led by a couple of proconsuls. And that shifted when Julius Caesar marched the Roman army back on the capital and took over and established the empire. And that led to a single ruler being in charge, ostensibly, even though some of the earlier systems still existed. there was a one single ruler who was the one making final decisions. Um, there was also a political shift that was interesting between the Qin and the Han Dynasty in China. Not an identical shift, but the idea is that the Qin unified China, ruled for about 20 years, and at least some historical sources suggest that they used the same methods they used to conquer China in ruling it, which made people upset because it's not fun to be ruled as if you're being conquered. And so that empire fell apart and was quickly replaced by the Han Dynasty, which decided it had to make some changes and adopted Confucianism as a way of promoting virtue in people rather than this kind of oppressive legalist, people are evil and need to be controlled idea that the Qin Dynasty was using. There's a lot of similarities in social structures, lots of social stratification. Um, and then the eventual fall of these empires is really similar as well, as both were weakened. There were some environmental issues and then barbarian invasions. So the second part of this article suggests then that although Rome and China were very similar, the Great Divergence explains that after that, Europe and East Asia embarked on really different pathways. China reunified after the fall of the Han, not immediately, but by about 400 years later, the Sui and Tang dynasties had reunified China. Europe never reunified the same way. Western Europe was always really fragmented despite some attempts by people to reconquer it. It was known as the Holy Roman Empire, even though it was basically just a bunch of separated feudalistic states. The eastern half of the Roman Empire stayed connected, politically unified as the Byzantine Empire, but it slowly lost territory over time until it also was split up and it fell in 1453. So the big piece historically is that China remained centralized and unified in a way that Western Europe did not, which had some interesting historical consequences that we will explore in later units. That takes us to the end of this review, and I'm going to leave you with a sample AP question. This is a comparative question, so it's asking for similarities and differences, and it's looking at political control, which is much of what we've just been talking about. So take a few minutes to brainstorm about this question, pick two of the three empires listed below, and try writing a thesis statement. You want your thesis statement to identify an important similarity and an important difference. At this point, you probably want to pause the video because I'm going to go on and talk about some possible answers to this question and provide a sample thesis for you. So take a few minutes just to try this on your own and then go ahead and continue watching. So I'm going to move ahead now, if you're ready, and discuss some possible ways of approaching this question. Here's how I would start. I'd start by making a list of similarities and differences, like I've done here. I think that in a lot of cases, the similarities are going to be more broad and vague because you are pulling together some big picture ideas about these societies. And so for similarities, the first thing I'd identify simply is that these societies, these empires, the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty, the Mauryan and Gupta empires, they were ruled by a single king, and that this king was often thought to have godlike powers. A good example of this in China is the Mandate of Heaven. The second similarity that's worth noting is the existence of legal codes in all of these societies. And legal codes are a really key method of control. You also need to have a literate government bureaucracy that can read these legal codes and enforce them, and that can act as the hand of the king, essentially, as an emissary from the capital, from the ruling class, to make sure that the laws of the empire are enforced. That connects to this third point, which is you need governors to rule provinces. It's not possible when you have an empire of this size to have one person micromanaging every piece of it, and that means that you need trusted governors to carry out the orders, and you need to split up the empire into various provinces or governorships or whatever you want to call it. So these are all similarities between these places. it wasn't possible to rule an empire of this size without some of these practices. So I'm going to think about differences next. And differences are going to tend to be more specific, and I'm going to focus on the different ruling ideologies of the places. The key to rule in Rome, especially during the empire, was the idea of citizenship. And so as the Roman Empire expanded and took over different people, those people were incorporated and assimilated into the empire as Roman citizens. And as Roman citizens, they were given certain rights. And in a lot of cases, the local aristocracy was brought in as governors to report back to the empire. And we call this a lot of times Romanization, the idea that you are making people feel like they are culturally assimilated into the Roman Empire. That's a really key piece of how the Roman Empire worked. In China, what you've got is, instead of using the local elites the same way, you've got a government bureaucracy based on a Confucian examination system, where people are brought into the central government. They are promoted based upon their understanding of Confucian values, and then they are sent out to rule various provinces. And so that's really different. It's a more centralized approach, and the ideology is a little bit different. And in India, you've got a different setup as well. You have this caste system, which really stratifies society into these different groups. That's not to say that you didn't have social stratification elsewhere, but in India, you have a really extreme version of that that maintains control by telling people where their place is in society. And so any of those differences would be really useful to highlight as you're working on this answer. I wrote a sample thesis here at the bottom, which you can read. I chose to compare the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire simply because that was the focus of one of the readings that we did in this unit. And as you can see above, I picked out the similarity about being ruled by a godlike emperor or king, and then looking at the differences in the ideologies. And writing the thesis is as simple as that.